Hello and welcome to my D&D Combat Curves series. This is all about designing combat encounters in a much more concerted way and thinking more like a designer. A lot of content out there regarding D&D combat really takes the idea of combat and just gives you a few tips and tricks to do things like make the combat more fun, make the combat more engaging, make it more likely that your players give you positive feedback at the end of the session. And these are all generally positive things, of course, but they're not very useful design tools because design, conceptually speaking, requires much more concrete understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. I'm going to try to create a framework that allows you to create your own D&D combats with your own visions, however you like, and just make you better at doing your own thing that you're already doing. It's going to involve more clearly defining your goals experientially for your players, and then giving you some tools that will help you achieve that much more clearly. Enter the combat curve itself. Now, design is challenging in part because you're going from these abstract concepts of how players think and feel, and then trying to map on systems and mechanics on top of that in order to create those outcomes. But that's quite difficult. You need some kind of bridge between those two, and that's what the combat curve is all about doing. So this all boils down to three major categories. First is the player experience, which is more abstract. Second is the curve itself, which bridges the gap between the player experience and the mechanics. And the third thing is the mechanics themselves. So how should we approach the player experience? There are basically two ways to do this, abstractly and concretely. The reason abstractly doesn't work very well is because you end up with a statement like, I want my combat to be fun. And that's true, you should want your combat to be fun, usually. There are some exceptions to that though. And the reason that that's not that helpful is because it's just, how do you design for fun? Or you can do it concretely, which is about taking those ideas and trying to break them down into something a little bit clearer. So you can say something like, I want my combat to be engaging, or I want my players to be having fun, and those are perfectly fine goals to have in general, but they're very abstract. If you use concrete design goals, things like, well, I want my players to experience a great deal of anticipation leading up to this fight, but then I want the fight to turn out to be much more than they bargained for. That's a pretty good goal for a combat encounter. You can design for that probably, and we can build a curve that maps on top of that intended player experience that we can then build mechanics to create the curve with. The curve itself is graphed along two axes. The bottom axis, which is time as measured in rounds, that's obvious, and the other axis, which is intensity. And the reason it's measured in intensity is because intensity maps onto almost anything, whether you have an optimized tactician or an RP focused story-driven player. Either way, and I don't think of those as mutually exclusive, by the way, but any kind of player will feel intensity, and the way that they feel intensity, they do a lot of the interpretation for themselves. So you need to focus on intensity, and they'll interpret that in a way that fits with their own playstyle, and that's why the framework works so well. So a good way to explain why I want my combat to be fun isn't a good goal is to look at the curves that would create. I want my combat to be fun. What curve would that create? It wouldn't. You can't make a curve out of that. You can't build a flow from that. And therefore, you can't build mechanics onto it. Now, you might be able to find other frameworks that do that somehow, but I have been working on that for a long time, and I've never been able to find one. My solution has been to just be a little bit more specific with regard to the mechanics. So over the course of this series, we're going to be going over 5 curves that I've designed and have used in my own games for quite a long time to great effect. These are not the only curves I've used, and they're far from the only curves that you can possibly make, because you can make almost any curve you like. But feel free to take them and use them if you'd like, or simply look at them as examples. Once we hit our 6th video, it'll be all about how to make your own curve, and the examples and the context that they provide will, I'm sure, be invaluable for that. The goal here is really to empower you to create your own designs to the best of your ability. Your understanding of those designs will be cleaner, your designs themselves will be cleaner, And you'll have so much of an extensive understanding of how the designs work that you'll be able to create any scenario. And as you improve, you'll be able to create crazy combats that you otherwise would have thought were probably impossible. You can do things like make super long combats that don't feel that long, or super short combats that do feel really long. You'll find this also works well with other goals that you have. So if you're a story-driven DM and all you want to do is really tell stories, these will still help you. These will still help you tell better stories. And if you're all about combat and tactics and the battle map, these will obviously help you too. But the point is that the curves will help you accomplish any goal you already have. So I hope you enjoy this series, and more importantly, I hope you learn something effective from it that you can take and apply in your own games.